Donald Trump, Kosha, also pointed out Keir Starmer's comments, and there's been a lot of commentary about those comments and that of other leaders who've pledged to stand by Ukraine. Let's have a listen to what Keir Starmer had to say.
The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air, together with others. Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing. We're working with the US on this point after my meeting with President Trump last week. And let me be clear, we agree with the President on the urgent need for a durable peace.
Kosha, he went very quickly there from boots on the ground to this plan is dependent on the US backing it, to he agrees with President Trump about the urgent need for a durable peace. How do you see that statement? Because people have listened to that first section about boots on the ground. The whole thing only goes for 30 seconds, and they seem to have disregarded the subsequent 20 seconds.
And in this day and age of social media, you can just clip what you need and then engineer narratives around that. But it was funny for me because it reminded me of that great quote from the late and great Margaret Thatcher, whose seat he currently sits in, who said the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money. And he and all of Europe is kind of showing that not at a national level, but at a global level. It's easy for them to talk tough when it relies on spending American money and maybe American troops. You can add troops to that sentence in addition to money. And so they're all paper tigers. And this Ukraine thing is sort of a flashpoint in what Trump is trying to do in terms of recalibrating the European-US alliance as it relates to defense more broadly. And this is just an accelerant, I think, to that end game that he wants to get to.
And we do hear a lot from the European countries about how much they're doing for Ukraine, how much money they're contributing, how strong their support is. Meanwhile, this is the reality. The EU imported Russian fossil fuels in the third year of the invasion. The amount that they imported surpassed the 18.7 billion of financial aid they sent to Ukraine in 2024. So, Kosha, on the one hand, they are providing some aid, none of them as much as the US, but they're also enriching Russia because their own energy policies are so broken that they have become reliant on Russia for their energy.
That's such a great point because there's been a lot of focus on one side of the ledger, which is how much money the US is spending versus them on defense, and there's some dispute around the number we've put into Ukraine. But the point is nobody disputes that the US is carrying the lion's share of it. But the other side of the ledger, what you're showing, is fascinating too, because if they really cared, they would, I don't know, Germany would turn back on their nuclear industry that they decimated for green and other reasons. That would be one way to weaken them, maybe buy more from the US, maybe cut other types of deals. They're not doing that, so it's all talk, little action, unless it's easy action, like sanctioning Russia or freezing some of their assets in the banking sector. They've done a little bit there, but not really much more. And unless Zelenskyy comes back to the table, I think you're just going to see this whole trend continue.
And all this talk about the Trump administration is pro-Russia, pro-Putin, this absolute idiotic nonsense passing for analysis. Let's not forget, even in the first Trump term, he was in Europe telling Germany and other countries, do not become reliant on Russian energy. It is a weakness. And they laughed at him, Kosha. They did not heed that advice at all. And here we are, where they are emboldening, enriching the Putin regime at a time when they're saying that we stand with Ukraine.
Great point. And so many of the things that Trump says, they age really well. When they come out of his mouth, people don't like them. He's a little bit coarse. He's a little bit rough around the edges. But they always age, and he always ends up being true. And that was something that was very prescient, as are many other things that he said. And on the flip side, a lot of these European leaders are not exactly sympathetic figures, certainly not Keir Starmer among the electorate, not Zelenskyy. A lot of people just don't like him personally in terms of his demeanor and the amount of travel he does, and he goes to awards shows and has rung the bell at the stock exchange.
For fashion magazines.
Yes, he's not a sympathetic figure. And on this side, they're trying to paint Trump as a stooge of Russia, and that whole thing has lost its potency. So that's not going to work anymore.
No, I think it had a bit more credibility when they were running that entire Russian collusion hoax. Not credibility, that's the wrong word, but people were believing that hysteria. But since that's been completely debunked, it just sounds like desperation. And on Europe, here is some more sobering data. Again, Europeans, many of them feel that Ukraine should be getting more support. The polling shows that. You can see that there. But the polling also shows that they don't want that support to come for their country. As you can see there, even the countries with the highest percentage of people wanting greater support for Ukraine, Denmark there is at the top of the list. 66% think Ukraine deserves more support. But only 17% of Danes, Kosha, want Denmark to increase its support. It really just sums up this European virtue signalling where they talk a big game, but really even their own populations don't have the appetite for greater support. And this is on their doorstep. So I don't see how people think Americans should care more about this. We shouldn't have an America first approach in the United States when this conflict is in Europe and the Europeans seem to be a little bit apathetic about it.
Yeah, it's going to be a big reckoning for them because the flip side of them stepping up their spending on defense and maybe them providing the security guarantee is going to mean cutting back spending, austerity measures, these big lavish social safety nets that Europe has loved and had for half a century. There are meaningful repercussions from this for them to kind of recalibrate their approach to government as a whole. And the other thing about that is that's very useful is it gets to the crux of the point, which is, yes, we all support this war ending. We support Ukraine's right to sovereignty. We certainly support their soldiers and civilians who've been harmed and killed and injured and displaced. We support democracy. Everybody supports those things. But when the rubber hits the road, what does it mean in terms of prioritization? And you as a nation spending money and spending troops to do that, that's where things shift because we live in reality. We don't live in utopia, and that's what even the Danes see that and everybody sees it, but the leaders don't seem to want to acknowledge it.
Well, most people do see it, but sadly, the bulk of the media seems to be not living in reality. They're living in some fantasy world. Well, I don't know, there's some sort of Greta Thunberg approach to geopolitics where, you know, what you want to happen must happen regardless of the reality. And the reality is Ukraine is losing this war. America doesn't want to keep funding it. And either you surrender to Russia, which nobody wants, you keep fighting with backing of European countries and the US soldiers on the ground, which could spark World War III with a nuclear power. I don't think anybody wants that either. Or you negotiate a peace deal that's advantageous to Ukraine. And that's where we were before this meltdown in the Oval Office. And we've seen many pro-Ukraine foreign policy experts, those who have championed extra funding for Ukraine from the US, have admired Zelenskyy for many years, be appalled by his antics in the White House and what has followed. And among them is Washington Post columnist Mark Thiessen, who has written a piece that saying Zelenskyy must mend the breach with Trump or resign. Kosha, he details Zelensky's conduct in that 50-minute press conference leading up to that clash. Everyone's seen the clash, but what led up to it, that 50 minutes, if you've watched the entire thing, it gives you a very different perspective. And he called President Zelensky's behaviour unnecessary and reckless and questioned why he'd be so rude to Trump in front of the media. When Trump was offering him a really advantageous deal. He was getting a great deal of what he wanted. And there were even concessions made, you know, quite late in proceedings.
When you've lost Mark Thiessen and Lindsey Graham, by the way, who's been on fire excoriating Zelenskyy, he was the most pro-war U.S. involvement senator that we have.
Yes.
That is a signal that he did misstep here, even though not everybody in international media and even U.S. media is seeing it that way. And this was a great piece by Mark Thiessen because he went through the entire 49 minutes, and 40 of those 49 minutes where actually Trump was very magnanimous, very cordial. And throughout that time, there are multiple points at which Zelenskyy was kind of goading him.
When you watch the whole thing, I've got to say, one of the more shocking things was how patient President Trump was. That's not his style. He let so much go to the keeper until at some point it was too much and he had to step in and check Zelenskyy. But there was a lot of disrespect, a lot of behaviour that Trump wouldn't normally tolerate up until that point.
Absolutely. And that point was when Zelensky said that, you know what, you will feel it too because you have an ocean. That's why you don't feel it now. You will feel it too. And at that moment, you can see Trump's entire demeanor change, his face lit up. And he said, American people are watching this. You do not come here. You're in no position to say that.
Absolutely. And it was an astonishing comment to suggest that America is somehow should be fearful of a Russian invasion. Kosha Gada, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.